Welcome to Parent, and I've really been looking forward to visiting with Linda Murphy, who I feel like I have known a long time.
Hmm.
Linda, I don't want to make you feel old or something. I do. I feel like you've just been a part of the RDI community for a very long time. Thank goodness. And I would say, whenever we hear from you, we always hear some greatness. So we're so excited you could join us. And you have written another book, Co-Regulation, a handbook, and which I love the title. I think it's a great title because it just gets right to the point of what we need. How did you decide to write this book? I'm so interested.
Yeah. Well, so Declarative Language Handbook, um, obviously was my first baby that I just needed to get out there. And then, I had known that I wanted to write something else, but I didn't know what it was. And honestly, how it happened is during the pandemic, when we were first in lockdown, or for a large part of the year, I would just take long walks every morning. And just one morning on one of my walks, it came to me that this is what the next book needed to be. Because I think I had thought about writing about activities, but I couldn't go there because I felt there was still more to teach at the ground level. And I know I say this in my book, but that's really what it came down to: is declarative language doesn't always work. And what do I do when it doesn't? I pull in what I know about co-regulation. And I just feel like those two concepts are just really important partners to each other. And I hadn't yet completed my job if I didn't write also about co-regulation. So that was my inspiration.
Well, you inspired all of us, and I have enjoyed reading the book. And I love how you just take us through step by step. So that's what we're going to do as we visit. Let's start with, what is co-regulation? We'd love to hear a definition.
I'm like, go ahead. No.
You
I
first.
think, well, and another reason is because I feel like, so I've been an RDI consultant since 2007, and I still feel like I'm constantly learning what co-regulation is, finding better ways to explain it, helping it be meaningful. So that was just another piece of the book, is I feel like it's this complex idea that's hard to explain, and it's out there. And so I really just wanted to be able to explain it in a clear way. There's so many pieces to co-regulation, but in a very basic sense, it just means that we are responding to each other contingently, moment to moment. And I think that's at the crux of it. So I'm not telling you what to do or say. You're not telling me what to do or say. We perhaps have a frame that we're working within, but there's degrees of freedom for us to contribute in our own unique and meaningful way. Um, and that's co-regulation, and it just unfolds, and you can't predict what it's going to look like person to person, or communication between communication partners. um, and you just have to appreciate the process. And I think a big part of it is just being able to let go and know that it's something that unfolds naturally when you're in that space, to accept it and appreciate it, and just kind of let it happen.
And it just happens all the time in all we do. That's why it's so interesting that it feels complicated to explain. But I think one of the reasons is we just never think about it. And when we get to where we are, we have to think about, what is it? And that's one of the things I love about how you explain co-regulation, because you talk about it on a practical level. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And so I think in my experience, when working with kids with social learning differences, say in 2007, before I became an RDI consultant, the mindset is that we have to force an outcome, or, help them say something very specific or do something very specific. And co-regulation really helps you let go of that mindset, again, so something can unfold, like I said. So on a practical level, it's just when you think about approaching any interaction or any process that you might need to do, and think about the idea of contingency, and just creating roles between communication partners. And once you have that mindset of contingency, and the other piece of it is helping kids be competent in the role that you assign to them. Once you have that mindset, it can apply anywhere at all that you want, but you have to bring those two thoughts to the table, that the child has to have a competent role and it's going to be contingent on yours. And also authenticity is important. So on a very practical level, if you bring this idea to, for example, setting the table, you might create the roles of plate passer and plate setter, or fork hander and fork placer. So you're just creating contingent roles to get the process of setting the table done. Or putting books on a bookshelf, it might be I hand you a book and you put it on the shelf. Or it could be we're playing catch together. I pass the ball to you, you pass it back to me. And you need both of those people to keep the game going or keep the process going. But you don't necessarily control what the other person is doing or how they do it. You just create that opportunity for contingency and competence in kids.
I think that when you talk about it like this on the practical level, it takes away from the word co-regulation being so overwhelming at times, because once you start talking about things like plate passer, well, that's something we've all done. We do just about every day. So I love that about how you approach co-regulation, not from a big complexity, but really simple, right?
Yep. And it's just knowing that you can create competent contingent roles anywhere on a practical level, and that makes it less scary. You can wrap your head around it and make it happen, or create opportunities for it to happen.
Well, you talk a lot about roles, and I thought maybe we'd give a little clarity to folks about what you mean about roles and why it's important that the child has a role. This is a concept that parents I've worked with have said really changed their lives, thinking about things in terms of roles.
Yeah, I think anytime you enter an interaction, there's uncertainty. And I think for kids with social learning differences, the uncertainty causes anxiety. So if you enter as the guide with a competent role in mind that you can communicate to the child, then they're going to feel less anxious. They're going to be able to sustain engagement for longer periods of time. So entering any co-regulatory opportunity, it's important for the guide to have a thought about what a competent role might be for the child, so that they can communicate that clearly to the child to help reduce the child's anxiety and therefore likelihood that they're going to engage or respond to the invitation.
One thing I love that you say is that the role has to be authentic. And you talk about how the children know if we're making something up. Mm-hmm. I love that. Can you expand on that a little bit for us? Why is that authenticity so important?
Yeah, well, it's just important on so many levels. Like for the kids know when something's contrived and it's not real and you're just doing it to do it. Like kids can spot that a mile away. So the more real something can be, the more authentic, I think the increased likelihood that they're going to engage, buy in, be invested in it. And then on a big picture, it's meaningful because you're helping them be a contributing member to the family or the household. You're in essence teaching them life skills at a pace that's manageable for them. So you're getting toward just activities of daily living, eventually executive functioning skills. You're just teaching real life things that matter. So that's why it's great just to use authentic roles, because everybody benefits from it. The child feels proud and they know they're contributing. And it also ends up being helpful to the parent or caregiver or guides, because the child truly is contributing to the household and making a difference.
And I thought, I'm going to confess to you something about myself, which is I tend to be a goal person. So from authenticity to goals, the not having a specific goal was something I really had to, and in my life have to be mindful about when I need to be. Why is that so important though? Why is it so important when you go into an engagement with a child to not have an end goal in mind?
Yeah, because I think, you could have lots of goals, but I think what varies is the pace with which you're going to get there. Like, of course, we all want our kids to be able to brush their teeth, make their meals someday, get dressed. But you can't, if you focus on that end product, then you are going to pick up your pace and get product focused. And as a result, it's about your pace versus what's an optimal pace for the child. So if you slow down and just can be in the present moment with that child, then you're able to really read their feedback in the moment and get a strong feedback loop going so that you can give them more information when they're actually ready to take it in. And part of that, again, is just letting go and being present in the moment with the child so you can match your teaching to a pace that is optimal for their learning. And so it's not that you're not going to get to all these important goals in life. You are going to get there at a pace that is important for the child's learning. And so letting go of the end goal in the moment allows you to just optimize your teaching in the moment and go at the pace that's right for both of you. And that feedback loop that's really important between the guide and the child.
I think that product, and again, confessing to be product minded at times, it actually gets in way of that overall process goal that you're trying to have with your child. And I wonder, in your experience, which is vast at this point, is this a more challenging thing for parents to do? I've had parents say to me, it's just so hard for me not to get the idea of the product mindedness out. And I think part of that is honestly is kind of our own experiential memory of having our kids in assessments where bullets are ticked off and that type of thing, this goal, that goal. How do you help parents understand this concept?
Well, I think when they start to do it, they see it happening and it feels so different than prompting and prodding and pushing that I feel like once parents, caregivers, guides feel co-regulation, even kids for that matter, it feels so much better. And I don't have to convince because they see it and feel it.
I think that's beautiful. And this is true with any relationship. If you have a product as a goal, you don't really end up focusing on your relationship first, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I always say RDI is good for all relationships.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that you spend a bit of time on is collaboration and co-regulation. And this is an area I've heard parents really want more information on when they're working together, collaborating. How do you define collaboration?
I would think of collaboration as working as a team toward a certain goal. But again, the goal doesn't need to be a very specific end product. It could just be something like an art project where you're building something together, but neither of you necessarily has a specific picture in mind of what it's going to look like in the end. But for collaboration, I just think of working towards something together, towards a greater goal together.
Um, would you think something like a mural? Could you talk about specific activities a little bit?
Yeah, because I can even share. This is an example from the book. But so I had two children and we were working on what I called it a group mural, and we hung a large piece of paper on the wall. And as the guide, what I wanted to do was set up competent contingent roles between these two children. I was in there at the beginning to model and guide, but because my focus in that moment was peer interaction, I wanted to be able to set up the roles clearly so that I could fade back and allow them to continue it on their own. But there were parts that I provided some limits or guiding, but then lots of places where I could give them freedom to come up with that on their own. So what we did initially was just decide what it is that we wanted to draw together. And so on my part, I gave them some ideas, but I wasn't going to be the one who dictated what they chose as a team. But I said, we could draw a city, we could draw a jungle, we could draw a zoo, we could draw something else. And they decided to draw a city. So our collaboration was, let's draw a city together. But again, we don't have a very specific picture in our mind of what that city is going to look like when it's done, because that's going to come down to the co-regulation between the two children. And then the competent contingent roles that I set up were drawer or observer or watcher. So when one child was drawing, they would add one item, and then the other child would watch. So for these two children, I knew that I could have them take turns in that way. Other kids who maybe aren't as further along, it wouldn't be as comfortable for them to wait for their turn, and maybe they would need to draw alongside each other. But these children were at a place where I knew that they could handle that challenge well. And then what happened is they would add one item, and then just coincidentally, the next child would add an item, and it became related over time to what their peer had drawn. So for example, one child drew a skyscraper, and then the other child on his turn drew clouds in the sky. Another girl, she drew maybe a sun in response to the cloud. Another time, the boy drew a sidewalk, and then she drew someone walking on the sidewalk. So they just kept up this contingency without me telling them to, but it was really important that I had set up the competent contingent roles for them, and just the frame or the loose idea of what it was that we were collaborating about. And I say this in the book as well, but what ended up happening is when the girl drew the picture of the person walking, she just on her own said, "That's my grandma." And her friend said, "Well, what about your grandpa?" And she said, "Oh, my grandpa died last year." Mm-hmm. And then they just went on to talk about their grandparents. And it was just this really beautiful, touching moment to me that I knew, like as a speech therapist, if I had just pulled out, like, for example, a topic card with a picture of grandparents and said, "Let's talk about our grandparents," like it wouldn't have had that same emotional connection, that same authenticity, that same curiosity about each other that just naturally developed because they were working together in this co-regulatory pattern. And it was just beautiful. And again, like it's examples like that that show me co-regulation is where it's at, and you have to start there to get to all the other really great stuff.
Well, that moves on more great stuff talk, because that was the next thing I wanted to ask you about is, why is co-regulation a key to conversation? You focus a lot on that, and even in that lovely story you told us. Why is that so important?
Yeah. And I just always take that story with me because it was so touching to me. Mm-hmm. But what happens with co-regulation? And you start co-regulation without language demands, without words. What you are doing is helping kids internalize reciprocity, because anytime we have any social interaction, it has to be balanced where I take a turn, you take a turn, I take a turn, you take a turn. And then with conversation, it becomes, I share an idea, you share an idea. I ask a question, you answer, but then you ask a follow-up question. So at the heart of conversation is reciprocity and just that back and forth volleying. And if we cut to conversation or speed ahead to conversation and just place language demands on kids, we don't allow time for them to really internalize that reciprocity, which is at the heart of conversation. So co-regulation really helps you go back and practice reciprocity and let everybody internalize it. And that also goes for not just kids, but caregivers, because caregivers, if they haven't done co-regulation with their kids, or if they've set up more demanding or imperative context, they too have to learn how to really have balanced reciprocity where we're not controlling each other. So it just really gives everybody that practice, but then certainly kids, which then they can take it elsewhere with new communication partners in the future.
I thought reading about the connection of co-regulation to conversation was really beautiful. And I thought about if sometimes the case was, and if you had found that when folks were having trouble with conversation, it went back to maybe co-regulation wasn't where they thought it was. Mm-hmm. Is that the case at times?
Yeah, definitely. And this made me think of even one other skill. It's just within conversation, there's frequently misunderstandings or communication breakdowns where I don't understand my communication partner, they don't understand me, maybe we didn't hear each other. And as a person within a conversation, you really have to become good at making repairs or recognizing when those breakdowns happen. But co-regulation also really actively works on breakdowns and repairs and helps kids become more competent noticing breakdowns and more confident in persisting with repairs. And they take that skill with them to conversations as well.
This is a quote from your book, and I think it fits in really nicely to your story about shared focus and the grandfather who had passed, and how it helps. The word that really strikes me is it establishes a shared focus. But I can see so clearly that if that's not happening, a lot of that key can be that we just need to go back and look more at co-regulation.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we discover obstacles like that, it it's an exciting thing because you know what you need to do, don't you?
Yep. Yeah. Say that question one more time, though, so I answer it more
I think
clearly.
when we can look at something in regulation, hey, we just need to go back and work some more on co-regulation and just not worry about talking right now.
Yeah, totally.
It's an exciting thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think co-regulation is very grounding and emotionally connecting. And all those things are important for all communication, including conversation moving forward. So it's always great to just go back to being together and being in the moment.
That's something we don't take enough time to do. Sometimes I can tell you as a parent, we forget there's a thing as such as just being.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the most important things we can learn.
Mm-hmm.
I I wanted to take a few minutes because in your book you talk about some things that you hate to see, and I really was um, my heart really felt for you because I know you do go and see things in the classroom and others places as well. And you talked about, for example, seeing children be ignored. Can you talk a little more about that, um, and why for you that's such a hard thing to see?
Well, I mean, so many reasons. I think even on a very basic level, as a speech language pathologist, it pains me to see communication attempts being ignored because there's so many different and better ways to respond to a child than to ignore them. If you ignore them, you're essentially saying your communication doesn't matter. I think you can communicate respectfully to them that, perhaps, we all have kids who maybe get off track when we need to keep them on track. And I think there's respectful ways to communicate that to them that gives them more information than just ignoring. Like I might say to someone, I can tell that's really important to you right now. I want you to know I hear you, but we don't have time to talk about it right now. Let me help you remember it, and we can talk about it in a little bit. So I always just want to give them information that they're important to me. I hear you, or I hear them. I am validating their feelings. And if we don't have time at this point, at this moment in time, to go to dive deep into the topic that they want, like I'm going to let them know, but I'm also going to help them plan for a time that we can, which also just gets toward future planning and executive function. So that's a bonus. So that's like one example where maybe the child just wants to talk about something, but they're not feeling anxious. The story that I tell in my book is about a child who was asking the same questions over and over, but it was because he was feeling anxious. And the classroom just had the strategy of ignoring in hopes or with the thought that his questions would stop. And maybe they stopped, but his anxiety didn't go away. And I know he wasn't validated as a communicator. So those things just made me very sad for him. And I also just saw him, I talk about this in the book, but I saw him in that moment using questions to regulate. Like he was trying, through my lens, he was trying to co-regulate with the teacher because he was feeling anxious about something. And also because in that moment, he didn't have the skill set to regulate independently or self-regulate. He needed that guide, that teacher, that caregiver to help him in that moment. And just the classroom didn't see it that way.
I often think so much, Linda, is to, as you described how you would talk to a child, you slow down even as you talk. You can feel that you stop in that moment, you take the time, you're not in a hurry, you pause out, you stop the action and talk. I do think that is something that folks struggle with. Do you find that to be the case, and why do you think that is?
Why do I think
That,
it's
yeah, that folks, if you picture slowing down to a child who's asking you a lot of questions to explain beautifully, which I won't try to again because you explained it so beautifully, what's going on versus just ignoring them. I mean, that takes some time. And I do think folks have trouble slowing down, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. And I also think if you haven't practiced it, you don't know that it will work. So there could be some fear and uncertainty um, on from us or from the adults, just knowing that that language is important and will feed forward in a positive way. Like I think it's scary to try something new, but it comes easily the more you practice it. So I don't even think about it now because I've just had lots of practice doing it, and I know that the outcome is positive for both of us. Like it always feels better for that person and for me if I feel like I validated what they were saying, let them know it was important to me because it was important to them. Um, and they know that I care. Like those things are the most important to me.
I have had parents tell me that they were taught to ignore their children. And so, in some ways, and this is just for some, they are having to learn a new habit of not ignoring their child. And I think that's another thing, that if an original teaching or training is ignore your child, then you have to kind of relearn. And like you said, practice and make it
Mm-hmm.
a goal to practice. Um, and one thing you spend a lot of time on is linking all of this to independence. I was just fascinated by that. How is co-regulation linked to independence?
Yeah, so as we said at the beginning, you can use any really household activity or process that you want as a co-regulatory opportunity. So if you just start to think about what you can include your child in, no matter their age, as long as you assign them a competent role, um, you can get them started learning any number of things. So for example, you bring groceries home from the grocery store. You get them involved in unloading the groceries. So you pass them as an item to them and they put it on the table. So you have that competent contingent role. But then they master that. And then you think about, okay, what's the next piece of this that I can also transfer some responsibility or teach and guide them because the first part has become easy and now they're ready for more. So you might then say, oh, you know what, you can also help me start to put these things away, which then gives you the opportunity to teach them where each of the different items go, you know, which ones go in the fridge, which ones go in the cabinet, which ones go in the freezer. And you just continue to expand activities as they're competent over the course of time. And essentially what you're doing is you're teaching them all the things that you do, but as your little apprentice or partner.
Well, I love RDI for so many reasons, but one of the reasons is we put a big focus on always moving toward independence. And I love that you've included independence in how you think about co-regulation, because one thing I've heard Dr. Shealy say is it's never too early to think about independence. How do you talk to your parents about that?
Yeah, I think the same way. You know, I know I wrote examples in my book. Laundry's an easy one. So maybe initially the child is just helping put something in the washing machine. But then you just expand it as they grow. So then they help you with sorting by color. They help you carry it upstairs or to bedrooms when it's done. They help you put it away. So you're constantly just giving them more roles that they're ready for, and they might even come to a point where they don't need you anymore, and then you've successfully transferred your responsibility completely. one example that I talk about in my book is helping my boys clean their room. And, you know, it was a disaster. It was a pandemic. We hadn't cleaned in a while. And there were rules that I could give them that I knew they were independent in, but to give a very specific example where they were not yet competent in was putting on clean sheets. So I took the time in that moment to slow down, use declarative language, use co-regulation, teach them how to put clean sheets on their bed. And we did it in partnership probably the next few times. But the last time, most recently, that I asked them to or let them know that we needed to change their sheets, they did it on their own without me. You know, I was thinking, oh, I have to get upstairs and help them do this. But they came down and said, oh, we did it. So they had done it on their own. But I know I needed to take that time to slow down and partner with them and teach them how to do it. But now they've got it. So now I know they can do it on their own. They might not want me to know they can do it on their own, but they can.
Well,
but they impressed me. I was like, oh, wow, you guys got it. And it just happened.
well, I think about how much that kind of independence leads to them to be proud of themselves and to know that they can learn hard things and do them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful thing, isn't it?
Yep.
In your book, which we're so excited about, you do talk about what it looks like when co-regulation is mastered. Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time because we're going to get to a really specific part of co-regulation with our visit. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? This is a question I get.
Yeah, well, I think co-regulation is ongoing, and there's always going to be a part of, as I would say, patterns become more complex. We always have to learn something and adjust as things unfold. But when someone is comfortable co-regulating, I would say they're comfortable in that role of contingency, where we both are part of a process together, but we're not necessarily controlling each other. I think when a parent masters co-regulation with a child, it means they're comfortable letting go and not controlling, feeling like they have to control or dictate what the child does. I think when a child masters co-regulation early on, it's when they engage over a longer period of time. I think when I see kids sustain interaction over longer periods of time, I can see that co-regulation unfold. They're feeling more comfortable, not controlling things, but then so is the grown-up.
And I think that control issue is such a big one for both parties. You know, we talk about the parallel process. So a lot of times in control, we think of the child, but there can be control issues. And I say this as a parent from a parent's side as well. True?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like we both have to be comfortable letting go. And I think, you know, with our kids with social learning differences who often want to control because of anxiety, interestingly, the way that they are going to learn to let go is kind of when we do it first. We have to be comfortable going there first.
I will say as a parent, I think sometimes the desire not to let go of control is also caused by anxiety. So again, it's a process that as a parent, you can have such anxiety, it's hard to let go and just let something happen. So it's so interesting to me how we see how everything is just this parallel process, Linda.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's a great point. And I think what helps us all feel better about letting go is knowing that we're going for patterns. Because once we see the pattern, once the child see the patterns, then we all know where we're headed while allowing degrees of freedom to happen.
Well, that is just a beautiful statement. And it leads us right into problem solving, which we're really going to spend time on one particular area as we visit. But I wanted to go over some of these. And we really did go over that one of the big issues can be that no pattern is established and that we need to have a pattern. And if we as mindful guides haven't really thought about that, that can be problematic. Also, Linda, and this is such an area for parents, just choosing the right activities to get started. How do you guide parents in this?
Yeah, so this is actually, I'm going to use a phrase that I remember Dr. Gutstein saying when I was training to be an RDI consultant. He guided us just to think about what the child can do. So it's not necessarily where you want to get a year from now. It's just authentically and from a competence perspective, what is it the child can do or that you could perceive them to be able to do pretty much on their own? And that's where you start. It's really helpful to think about household routines because they're just things that come up constantly. And they're just easy to fit in. So let's see, I'll use a couple of different around the house routines that you might have lots of opportunities throughout the day. So say, for example, it's a cleanup routine and you're putting toys in a bin. You might think about whether the child could put the toy in the bin on their own, or perhaps if you have them hand it to you and you put it in. So it could be you hand the toy to the child and they put it in the bin. But if you sense that might not be competent, you could have them hand it to you and then you place it. Or perhaps it's something that you lift together and then put in. So you just want to think about like what might be a competent role or something that they could be successful in within that cleanup routine. And even to go just to talk further about competence, I think, say you're cleaning up a lot of toys, another competent role would just be thinking about how many toys do you want to ask them to do. So if there's 20 toys on the playroom floor, it might not be competent to ask them to participate in all 20, but maybe you could perceive that they might successfully join in putting 3 away with you within a pattern. Then that's what you go for. I think it's really important to always end on a high note where the child's been successful, where you've been successful, where you both walk away with positive memories of this teamwork and pattern so that you can come back another day without feeling like it's going to be a struggle. So that's like cleanup, for example, because I know those things come up all the time. Another one might be book sharing. So no matter what the child is, if you wanted to get them into a pattern with a book, like when they're very young, sometimes I hold the book and they're the page turner, and that's something that they could be competent in. If I feel like the pages might be tricky, I get the page started, so maybe I turn it part of the way, and then the child turns it the rest of the way, so we're page turners together. Or like I said, I'm the book holder, they're the page turner. If they're a little bit older, perhaps reading could be a role, maybe not the whole page, maybe a line. If your child's into numbers, maybe just identifying the number on the page could be their role, and that could be a competent role where you could say, okay, I'm the reader and you're the page number person, where they get to just call out the page number. So you're just really thinking about what is it that they could do independently without you prompting them. And those are all the really good places to start, just thinking about what can they do.
As you were speaking, it really went for us right into the third point, which is sometimes we can get too much variation in the pattern that we start. I was thinking about just years and years ago, many years ago, a family just starting out, and they read quite a lot about RDI, attended some conferences, and they were trying to establish a pattern, but they started adding changes really fast. It would be maybe like 2 turns in a new ball, 2 turns, and they'd start going really fast. And really what had happened was they really weren't able to get a pattern established before they were trying to put in that all important later variation. How do you help people slow down? Because there is, and even for number 4, making changes just too fast with pacing. Mm-hmm. I think those things as a parent are just very common to want to do because you're trying to move on.
Yeah. So I think it's always, you can never go wrong with hanging out at one level for a bit of time, because you don't ever want to move ahead before the child is ready, because that's what can lead to breakdown. Not that breakdowns are okay, because we also want to work on repairs, but when you're just starting out, you just really and truly want the child to feel completely competent in their role. And so, in my experience, you don't want to add that variation until you are sure and they are sure that they are completely competent in the role that you've established. And if as you do it more, it becomes easier to watch your child's cues. But really, the way that you can tell that they're ready for a new role is when the role they're at is becoming too easy. and they're starting to perhaps become bored, and they're ready for a challenge. And often kids might seek out that challenge on their own, or you might start to see like, oh, they're getting bored with this and their attention is drifting. And that's where you maybe want to add in a variation or change it up a tiny bit. But I think it's always easy to add in variation, so that you don't have to rush to get there. I think just really establishing that confidence in the child is the most important thing. Just really, really, really helping them feel that. Because I do think too, the more kids feel confident, the longer they're going to hang in there with you. It's when they don't feel confident that they disengage. So it's really important to lay that groundwork.
And that leads me right into competency linked to skills within an activity, and that sometimes the whole issue of why we're having trouble relates to skills. How do you help parents evaluate that? Because again, as a parent, you can miss the mark on what you're thinking, and that's okay. I also want to point that out. It's okay to make mistakes, but how do you help parents with that?
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's really important to always keep in mind. Like, it's always okay to make mistakes. We all overshoot, we all undershoot. It's part of the dynamic feedback loop. The important thing is that you're watching and thinking so that you know when you need to make an adjustment in the moment. Like, lots of times I've given a child a role and then I've said, oh, whoops, that was too hard. Let me scale it back a little bit. And I think the ways that you tell that a role was too hard is if all of a sudden you feel like you're prompting a lot, like you're over prompting, or you're considering doing something like hand over hand, or you hear yourself talking a lot more than you were before. So those are just some of the cues that you might see, or the child, as I said before, or the child disengages or shuts down. Like, those are indications that it might be too hard for them.
And one thing I've seen too is that sometimes the children just think something is too hard for them. And we may think, oh, you can do it, but they're not ready. And I think that's really important to know that if they don't feel like they can do it, that's pretty significant for them.
Yeah. And I think at times it might be something where they did it yesterday. Why aren't they doing it today? But there's so many other factors that we might not have at our fingertips. They could be fatigued. There could have been other stress in the day. Maybe they're hungry. There just could be other obstacles getting in the way for them to not be able to assume that role as they did even the day before. And it's not that they're not going to again. It's just you want to take each moment in time and make your decisions as a guide based on the feedback in the moment. And just to honor what the child might be feeling. They, like you said, Kat, they might not perceive themselves to be competent. And those feelings of competence are just as important as their skill development, because it's the feelings of competence that are going to lead them to assume greater challenge moving forward. So that even goes back to what we were just saying on the previous slide, that we really want to hang out at those foundational levels so that they really feel confident, and then even maybe become the ones that initiate taking on more responsibility or seeking out greater challenge.
We are going to move very naturally, I think, into what we're going to settle in and discuss for a little bit, which is the need for an authentic role. So we've talked about roles and activities and obstacles, but this one can be huge. And I know you wrote in your book about the importance of the role being authentic. Can you explain to us what you mean by an authentic role?
Yeah, so it just means it's real. So that's why, but also the RDI community just really loves to use meaningful activities that are real, because the more real it is, the more it plugs into life and even meaningful skills that they're going to develop over time. So authentic just means maybe it's something that you need to do anyway for real, and you find a way to include the child in it. Contrived would be the opposite, and it's just where you're doing something just to do something, but it doesn't have that underlying meaning that an authentic role does. So even some examples, and like really, once you start to think about authentic roles, you realize that you can include kids in so many things that you do. Like it might be shoveling outside, taking out the trash, doing laundry. Even sometimes if we go back to book sharing that I was talking about previously, like you want to place a bookmark in a book, that's authentic, or make a bookmark that you're then going to use to place in a book. There's just so many process activities that you can get kids in on once you start to think in that way. And maybe like a good go-to is just anytime you do something around the house, think, is there a role that I could assign my child within what I'm doing? Or is there a competent role that I could assign to my child within a portion of what I'm doing? It doesn't have to be the whole thing. It could be a very small part of it. But we want it to be as real as possible, because then that all just feeds forward to life and responsibilities and more things that kids can learn about the world.
And what I think is interesting too is sometimes you have to slow down and not feel like you have to get everything done while your child's not there, or always have somebody else getting the things done. You really, I know one of the biggest things I talk to myself about as a parent has been, don't get everything done. Include your child. And I've had parents really, their lives have changed where I don't know how to say it differently, Linda, where they stop separating those things, like whatever it may be, cooking or gardening or what, they stop separating those activities from their child, but trying to figure out a way to include them in.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And actually, let me give you an example too that just happened last week with a family that I worked with. A mom has gotten in the habit of setting out her child's clothes each day because that process has not been competent for him, especially, say, for example, in the morning, they're rushing to get ready and out the door. So we talked about how to include him in that role in a meaningful way. And we talked about, okay, maybe don't do it in the morning because that would be too stressful. It's too rushed. What about if you do it the night before? And let's also think about why it might be hard for him. When we decide what to wear every day, it depends on the weather. It depends on what we're doing for the day. There's a lot of little mini decisions that you have to make, just when you decide what you're going to put on in the morning. And she said, oh, I never thought about that. Like I always check the weather to decide what we're going to wear, but I never thought to include him in that information gathering and then decision making or part of the process. And so then she just started, and it only took a couple of minutes to do it with him the night before. But what she's doing is just, building his skill set and independence over time in that one small task.
Yeah. And, one thing I've been thinking about, and this picture actually made me think about this, was that not all roles have to be work or, you can come up with a fun role and it's still authentic, right? So here there are plenty of this, but you can still come up with a regulatory pattern. You can still do all the things we're talking about, and with cooking or whatever else. So it's not to say it's about work per se as much as it is about relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I'm so glad that you said that too, because I don't want that part to get lost. But absolutely, it can, peekaboo is fun. Hide and seek with kids are fun. Book sharing can be fun. Cooking and making a little bit of a mess or a big mess can be fun. And I think when you let go, it allows that playful piece to be part of the process as well, because you do want to have those moments of joy and connection within what you're doing as well.
I love this because I really think this is so important for parents to hear. First of all, the question, why is it hard to think of roles? But I want anybody here who's going, this all sounds nice, but I get brain freeze when I try to think of something. You are not alone. This is just, for me, this is just part of the process of helping parents become guides. Why do you think that can be hard? Do you really think parents, and you've worked with so many parents over the years, do you think is a real brain freeze, or is it just part of repairing the guiding relationship? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that RDI really emphasizes and helps parents practice is planning a guiding engagement. When you get started, part of the process is before you engage your child, take time to plan the engagement and think through what might a competent role be. And your consultant is there to help you with this as you get started thinking in this way. So I think it might be hard in the beginning, and that's why we really emphasize planning those guiding engagements, even if they're only 5 minutes long, so you have time to enter with competence for both of you. But then I do think what happens is once you get that mindset going and you are able to think in terms of competence and what your child can do, it becomes easier to plug it in the moment. But I think, with anything you're learning, that studying time on the front end is important, but it's going to make a big difference as you move along and progress.
So when you have a parent, and I'm assuming over the years you have had parents who are stuck with coming up for roles, how do you help them through that? How do you encourage them actually?
Yeah, well, I probably just talk with them and really think through first, okay, what is the routine that you would like to think about engaging your child in? And then we really just break down all the possible roles that might be part of that process. And then within that, start to think about what is it that you can picture your child being able to do. And I can brainstorm well regarding possible roles, but then I definitely need the parents' help in thinking about what might be most successful for you, for the child. So brainstorming around a particular activity can be helpful. In my book too, I talk about different frameworks for roles, and just patterns that we can create, like an assembly line. So that's just you, me, place. I hand something to you, you put it in its place. So that's a frame that you can create competent roles a lot of different places, or a parallel frame where we're doing something together at the same time. So that might be carrying a laundry basket, bringing a recycling bin out. I like to think of complementary roles as when we're doing something that's connected but different. So it might be you're the bowl holder and I'm the stirrer. So I find that giving parents those frameworks can really also help in terms of thinking of competent roles, or all the possibilities of what competent roles or competent contingent roles might look like.
How do you help parents when they have, and I hate to use the word unsuccessful, but in their mind, because a lot of times my parents will tell me they were not successful. In my mind, they were, because we learned so much.
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, no matter what happens, you always learn so much. And that's that process of being a guide. But how do you help encourage them when they feel like they just aren't doing it?
Yeah, well, like you, I would encourage, and I do think every guiding engagement, we learn something new. And again, it's a dynamic feedback loop. So it just means we're learning about how we need to adjust, or whether we need to scale down or scale up. And we're not meant to know it all right away, but we learn through the process of doing. And I think, an important part is not just someone saying, oh, that didn't work, but it's more so saying, okay, well, let's think about what I want to do differently next time that I practice that same engagement, and even maybe going back to the same engagement and tweaking the roles so that they feel better, and knowing you can go back to the same thing again and bring what you learned.
If I had another slide that I would have made, it would have said something like, with the idea of, it's not really about that it doesn't work, that it's not about the blocks, or it's not about the ball. Over the years of doing assessment, et cetera, I've had folks tell me very honestly, I love it. He or she doesn't like blocks, they don't like balls. But what I found out was that they didn't understand their role with those. They didn't perceive themselves as knowing what to do with them. And I think that's so key to the work we do, don't you?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, that is often why the breakdown happens, is because the child just doesn't yet know what the role is, or they don't know what we're thinking. So then you even pull in a little bit of declarative language to better break it down or narrate what it is that you're thinking. I can't remember if I told this story. I don't think I did the last time we were here. But for example, I had created a routine way back with a child and her mom where I think they were building a tower or putting toys away. So it was just an assembly line. I hand to you and you put it in its place. And the mom had held out the item for the child to take and put it in its place. And this was at the very beginning of the pattern. And the child just stood there with their hands down at their side, not doing anything. And it was like, like what's going on? I really don't think this is too hard for her. But then we were actually able to figure out that what was going on is that the child didn't yet understand that nonverbal communication. So she didn't understand that when I hold something out, that means you can take it. So in that moment, we were able to figure it out, not right away, but after a little bit of just feeling stuck for sure. But then I said, you know what, I think she just doesn't know what this gesture means yet. So we said to her, so and so when mom holds out her hand with an item, that means she wants you to take it. And then she took it, and then we got going right away. But it just was a matter of clarifying that nonverbal communication. And that's where, again, declarative language really comes in and is helpful to help narrate what you're thinking when the child is stuck, or when we together as a team are stuck.
I always say, I don't think any of us like getting involved in an activity where we don't know our role and nobody will know us.
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
not very good at that. I admit it.
Yeah.
We will all feel incompetent if we don't have clarification. So one thing I love about visiting with you, and of course you've written a book on the whole subject here, is your passion. Why do you feel co-regulation is such a key to everything we do with our children? Where does that passion come from?
Yeah, well, and as I wrote the book, or just as I've thought about co-regulation over time, I think what being able to engage in co-regulation with your child really does is it really strengthens that feedback loop. So it really helps us be in tune to the child and be thinking about their learning style, what's going to help them, why they might be stuck, while at the same time helping them be in tune to us as their communication partner. I know we talked about this last time, but it just really locks in a joint focus of attention. So we know we're thinking about the same thing at the same time, but it really, really strengthens that feedback loop between two communication partners so that you can grow together, learn together, and, deepen your emotional connection with each other.
You're so passionate about your topics, whether you're talking about declarative language or co-regulation. Where does your passion come from? Have you thought about that? Spontaneous.
Well, I just love working with kids and families and young adults for that matter. And I feel like in the RDI community, I learned so much that made so much sense to me that I didn't learn in graduate school for speech therapy. And I feel like it's so applicable, it's so accessible, like anybody can learn how to do this. And I think I've become passionate because not enough people, in my opinion, know about declarative language, know about co-regulation, know how positive it is, and how good it can feel for both the parent and the child. And I just got tired, I think, of just saying it and decided to just write books so that I could share it more easily with others.